There's been lots of talk, particularly in Melbourne with the lockdown, about the impact on mental health and the looming fallout from the impact of COVID-19. If there was ever a time for our business leaders to install self-sustainability practices and arm themselves with the knowledge and support to keep them well, this is it. You'll have people in need. If you want to serve them, you need to support yourself first. As leaders, we have to be prepared to model the behaviours that make us sustainable and teach that to those for whom we're responsible. That makes all of business sustainable. In today's episode of Better Business for Good TV, Dr. Linda Wilson from Create Consciousness talks about self-care, or as Dr. Linda reframes it, self-sustainability for business leaders.
Better Business for Good TV. By small business owners, for small business owners.
Today we're going to be talking about self-care for business owners, which I suspect is something that, well, I know for a fact is something that we don't do enough of. But why do we even need to talk about it? Shouldn't we all be taking care of ourselves?
That is the question, right? Why is it obvious or isn't it obvious? And in my world, it's obvious because I see the results of a lack of implementation of self-care. And so my business wouldn't actually exist if there was people taking this self-care project seriously and actually doing that implementation. So on one hand, I can be glad. On the other hand, I'm clearly not doing my job well enough, right? So I think business leaders take their role very, very seriously in that they spend a lot of time, effort and money implementing these strategies, these self-care strategies, if that's what we're going to call them, for their teams, for their people. But when it actually comes to themselves, they really they just drop the bundle. You know, it's a little bit like the New Year's resolution that we make. We write it up on a piece of paper, we stick it up on the fridge, we screenshot it on our phone, and then we never ever look at it again. That's typically what I find.
And you know what's really interesting? You probably know that we've got the business improvement planning system, which is all of the practices that successful business owners do or successful businesses do that less successful businesses don't do. So we have all of that stuff in there for your staff. Doesn't rate a mention because it's not recognised, or it wasn't recognised by our many specialists. Perhaps we should have had you on the team as a business practice.
Yeah, well,
maybe when business owners are really focused on their businesses and building best practice businesses, they don't think about best practice self-care.
I think that if we can build this into an understanding of how it makes you a great business leader, if I can convince anybody today of that, I would be a really, really happy girl, because the bottom line is not doing this is unhealthy for people and it's bad for business, right? So things are clearly changing, Brenda, because you and I are actually having this conversation. So that for me is a really positive thing about this whole experience. And the problem though is that, as I said, people stick it up on the fridge and then they forget about it, and it becomes this sort of invisible thing that never ever happens. So what is actually missing is the creation of a structured approach, the infrastructure and the foundation to how this can actually happen in people's lives. And that includes getting support on board. That includes actually creating a plan, how, when, where, with whom. Yeah, it means getting a focus. So becoming really laser focused about what self-care means to me as an individual, not anybody else. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. Having aligned self-care goals, and aligned goals is something that I talk about a lot because it's a big topic, that one. And also, what are your action steps? So how are you actually going to implement this so that it makes a difference in your world? These are all the foundations that we need to put in place to have it happen.
So as a business owner, I have my business strategic plan and my business action plan. So I need to have my self-care strategic plan and action plan, as it were.
Absolutely.
The two will then, because the self-care one will enable the business one to work better.
It sure will. And I've got a term that I'm going to take you through I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The thing about the steps that I just mentioned, so support, plan, focus, aligned goals, and the actual action steps, when we don't do this, we are not building the neurology to keep it in place. We're not facilitating ourselves to create that change, and we're not getting habits into place that then become automatic so that we don't have to think about it, but we're still doing it. So there's a lot of really powerful things that we can do to really get ourselves down the track of this and have it be something that just becomes part of our normal mode of practice.
So we've talked about why it's important and a little bit about how to do it, but what might convince business owners, other than me, you've probably already convinced me, but what might convince most business owners that it's important, or what are the consequences of not doing it?
Yeah. So I always come back to the bottom line on this question, because I think it gets people's attention. And unfortunately, often the bottom line is a dollar figure. So I've got 3 pieces of research that I want to share with the audience today. The first one is a Medibank Private and Workplace Health Report. Now, this goes all the way back to 2008, and I'm using this specifically because I want to show people over a span of time that this is an ongoing issue. This is not just something that sort of was plucked out of the air at some stage. So in this particular report, the cost to the Australian economy is 14.81 billion a year. So Brenda, this is billion, not million. This is a significant chunk of change, right? This was in 2008. Then we get an ABC News report in October 2019, so much more recent. And this particular reporter shared the Shared Value Project outcomes, which was that the mental illness direct cost to business is estimated at $13 billion a year. So those 2 figures that I've just mentioned are quite similar. And from 2008 to 2019, we're getting similar figures. And then the last thing that I want to include is the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report that was done in September 2020. So very, very recently. And their report said that smoking rates increase with socioeconomic disadvantage, but illicit drug use is highest in the most advantaged areas. Now, what's the relevance of all of this? That's the important question. The relevance here is these reports didn't say, oh, but this excludes business leaders. These reports include all of us. Every single person working in the Australian economy is included in these statistics. So for business leaders to say it's not my problem, or it's my team's problem, or it's my employee's problem, is just, I think, a way to continue to delude ourselves that we're doing okay in this area, and we really aren't. So the underlying cause of all of the impacts of mental health issues, including stress, anxiety, depression, can all be dealt with through the self-care practices. And I truly, truly believe that our leaders need to be the ones that model that, because we know how powerful that is in terms of infiltrating that approach into entire organizations. It needs to come from the top and be modeled. Yeah.
It becomes a cultural thing. So it's a do as I do and do as I support and engage with and encourage, not just do as I say, or not this thing we say we do around here.
Exactly. And, you know, the numbers support it. I'm not sure of maybe 12 months ago now, Brenda, you might have heard of a New Zealand company that decided to have a 4-day week. Yeah. Because they decided that from a financial perspective, it was way better for their staff, way better for people's mental health, way better for productivity. So there are models out there that really do prove implementation of these strategies make a big difference across the board.
So is there still a stigma, do you think, around the whole concept of self-care? Do you think that's part of the issue?
I really think it's part of the issue. I think, as I said before, we're having this conversation. So I think it's really opening up. And there's no doubt that big organisations in particular who have the budget for it are implementing wellness programs. But we're talking specifically about business leaders, right? So if this was something that we celebrated as a part of positive cultural development within businesses, then we would see headlines that said things like leader X grows business exponentially, and they state categorically that this is because they personally implemented self-care practices and then taught their teams how to do it. Because that would be, that would be a growth statement, big time from my perspective. So I also think that the term self-care is something that can put people off. It might be a little bit touchy-feely. It might be a little bit, oh, I don't know if I want to go down that track because I'm really not sure what it means. But what I want to really emphasize is that self-care is about sustainability. And so I now use the term self-sustainability, because I think as a concept, we're so used to thinking about that in terms of sustainability of our business, but we don't make that relationship with ourselves.
I think that's because as you were talking, I was thinking we have an awful lot of listeners who are micro and solopreneurs who don't have a team to model to, and for whom everything rests on their shoulders.
Absolutely.
Every single thing in their business.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in that situation and your income depends on you continuing to do that and driving that, it becomes very difficult to put self-care in front of actually getting stuff done, because if you don't get stuff done, you're not going to have any money to do the self-care. But changing it to that word sustainability. So as I think a lot of people struggle with the concept of work-life balance, particularly if you're a solopreneur, because it's kind of, and I've done it myself a zillion times, it's kind of like, well, if I don't do this now, it won't get done. And that it's like, but if you think in terms of sustainability, then sometimes that kind of removes that sense of balance and puts it more into creating something that's sustainable. And maybe sometimes it's going to come in waves, and waves, I think, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think waves can be okay, because sometimes you're going to have to do more in order to maintain the income that will enable you to be sustainable, but it has to be sustainable.
It really does.
Yeah, and I think that maybe that's how you can arrive at some sort of realistic balance when you're a solopreneur.
I totally agree. I totally agree. You know, we keep thinking, and I agree with you, the intensity of business really does fluctuate. There's no doubt about it. And we need to be able to be flexible enough to manage that. So how do we create that flexibility? It's by practicing self-sustainability. So leaders need to refuel and recalibrate. We just keep on forgetting that we have to include ourselves in that nurturing mix. So that's where self-sustainability really comes in. You know, as you said, we talk about it for our businesses all the time. We need to talk about it for ourselves. And a big point that I make is we also have a neurological and physiological imperative. Like, this is science. It's not woo-woo. The results of implementing these practices make sure that we avoid the 90% of lifestyle and preventable illnesses simply by taking better care of ourselves, in particular our mental health. 90%.
That's a huge percentage, isn't it?
It's a ridiculous statistic, and we have control here, Brenda. This is the whole point. We can take control of this situation, which is why I get really worked up about it, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and I totally get it, because I know that I often don't manage that self-sustainability very effectively. It's kind of like it's got to be done. It's got to be done, and you just get stuck into a kind of a routine of doing it, so you suddenly realize that you're not doing it anywhere near as effectively as you were when you were being more balanced.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great way for leaders to actually check in with themselves. How effective am I being? And also, how am I being perceived by other people? because that's a really great way to check in with whether you're managing yourself well. Other people can give you that feedback if you're listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at the questions you've got here, and I think we'll just run through the rest of them. I think we might have covered some of them. As in, well, we've got what constitutes self-care, if we're going to call it. Let's change it to self-sustainability.
Yeah, self-sustainability, that's right. So this is really important because I think that people have got a little bit of an impression that actually I have to do all those things that everybody else says is self-care. So what is the point, though, of you going and having a massage if you feel really uncomfortable about getting massages? Or what is the point of you going and playing a game of tennis when you've never liked tennis and you just feel terrible after you've had a game? It's really important for you as an individual to find out what lights you up, what fills your cup, what makes you feel good, what allows you to be more productive, more efficient, and connect better with your people. That is what constitutes self-care for you. And I think it is really self-sustainability. I need to start using my own language because I'm so used to using that term self-care as well. So don't do what's uncomfortable. Don't do what exhausts you or makes you feel terrible. Do what feels good. That's the underlining thing here. And, think about self-sustainability as a way of refueling yourself. So what refuels you? That's the most important thing.
And even knowing we need it,
yes,
what might we be doing to avoid it?
Yeah. So this is our beautiful brain and mind at work. Okay. So neurologically, our brain says no to new habits or changes out of a routine that's considered normal. And if we don't set ourselves up to practice self-sustainability carefully, and that includes all the steps that I previously said, we actually trigger our mind into a no response. And that's because our mind, our brain, I use those terms interchangeably, its main job is to get you through your day, your week, your month, using the least amount of resources. And if we're trying to bring new stuff in, on top of all the other stuff that we've got going on in our lives, our brain will just go, you know what, Linda, I think that's too hard for you today. You need to just forget about it and go and do some more work because you're good at the work and the work is waiting for you. Go and do that. So we do have these biases or these tendencies that come up because of our own neurology. And sameness is something that our brain really likes because it's been there, done that. It doesn't have to utilize too many resources.
And why do you think it's more important than ever to be a leader and who models self-sustainability?
Yeah. So we all know that we've heard the stories. We don't know. We've heard the the background noise around the mental health implications of what we've just been through with COVID and lockdown. If you are not a leader who is refueling yourself and resourcing yourself at this time, how are you going to manage those people who are in your team, who are in your community, who are struggling with what they've just experienced? We have to fill our own cup before we have capacity to take care of other people. And we know that those people are there and their numbers, sadly, very sadly, may be increasing. So, yeah, that's my response to that one.
And it just prompted a thought in my head as well. It's not only about your team, it's about your customers.
Exactly. And we forget about them too in the equation. And, I think that relationship and rapport building is a lot harder for us to do. Again, there's neurological reasons for this as well. But we find it so much harder to connect with people in a really meaningful way when we're stressed, when we're anxious, when we're exhausted, when we're approaching burnout. So those connections, which are vital to our business, do tend to go down the gurgler as well.
So if you're a leader with a team, then clearly how your team is coping will reflect on how they cope with your customers. But if you're the solopreneur and your direct connection is to your customers, how you're coping is going to impact how you connect with your customers, and that's going to have an impact on your bottom line. So if you don't do the self-sustainability thing, you're going to impact your bottom line just as much as if you've gone, no, I'm too busy to do the self-sustainability thing and I'm going to focus on the customers.
That's exactly right. So no matter which way we look at this, you are doing yourself a favor by practicing self-sustainability. It will cost you more not to take this seriously.
You have been watching Better Business for Good TV by small business owners for small business owners. Previous episodes can be found in the Better Business Builders Community Resource Library at bb4g.co/community.